The parking lot was louder than it should have been at 7 in the morning. Doors slamming, engines starting, someone laughing 2 rows away. I stood still, keys cold in my palm, staring at the space where my car had been parked the night before. Not scratched. Not towed. Just empty. For a moment, my brain refused to cooperate. I checked the number painted on the curb. I checked my phone, as if a notification might explain where a brand new car disappears overnight. Then I called my parents. My mother didn't sound worried. She sounded amused. "Oh, Reagan," she laughed lightly, like I was overreacting. "We gave your spare key to your sister. She needed a reliable car." People walked past me. One man glanced at the empty spot, then at me, curious. I felt exposed, foolish, like the punchline of a joke I hadn't agreed to be part of. I said, calmly, "Okay. Just give me a minute." And I hung up. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to understand something about me. I'm not dramatic. I don't explode. I don't scream when something feels unfair. I've learned that reacting loudly only teaches people how much control they still have over you. So if you've ever been calmly disrespected by the people who should protect you most, stay with me. Ask yourself one question as you listen. What do you do when your own family decides your boundaries don't matter? My name is Reagan. And this was the morning everything quietly changed. I wasn't living recklessly. I wasn't borrowing money. I wasn't dependent. I had bought that car myself after 3 years of working late nights and saying no to things other people took for granted. It wasn't flashy, just new, reliable, and mine. To me, it represented control, something I'd learned to value because it was always in short supply inside my family. In our house, roles were assigned early and rarely revisited. My sister was the one who needed help. Emotional help. Financial help. Second chances. Third chances. I was the stable one. The responsible one. The one who could handle it. That label followed me everywhere, quietly justifying why things were taken from me and handed to her instead. My parents never asked. They informed. They believed that because I was calm, I was endlessly flexible. Because I didn't argue, I didn't mind. Because I made things work, they didn't need to worry about me. I contributed in ways no one counted. I paid my share on time. I showed up when my mother was overwhelmed. I smoothed over conflicts so dinners didn't explode. And when my sister crashed her first car, then her second, then her third, I was the one who drove her to pick up the rentals and sat silently while my parents sighed about how hard it was for her. No one ever said it out loud, but the expectation was clear. I would adjust. I always did. That morning in the parking lot, staring at an empty space, I realized something uncomfortable. This wasn't about a car. It was about permission. And somewhere along the way, my silence had been mistaken for consent. There had been signs before that morning, small enough to dismiss if you didn't want to see them. Comments made casually, like jokes that landed a little too precisely. My mother would say things like, "Well, you don't really need it right now," whenever I mentioned plans that required my own space or resources. My father would nod along, already convinced that I'd figure something out. The spare key was the first real clue. I remembered noticing it missing from my drawer a week earlier and assuming I'd misplaced it. When I asked about it, my mother waved her hand and said, "Oh, I moved it somewhere safe." I didn't press. I never did. Pressing was exhausting, and it always ended the same way, with me feeling unreasonable. My sister's behavior shifted too. She started dropping comments about how unreliable her current car was, how stressful it felt not knowing if it would start. Once, she laughed and said, "Must be nice to have something new and dependable." I thought it was envy. I didn't realize it was rehearsal. What unsettled me most wasn't the theft, it was the confidence. No hesitation. No apology. My parents had spoken as if this decision had been obvious, practical, even generous. Generous to her, at my expense. That morning, standing there with people moving around me and my phone heavy in my hand, I felt the first crack in something I'd relied on for years. Trust doesn't shatter all at once. It splinters quietly, piece by piece, until one day you realize you've been holding it together out of habit, not safety. I walked back inside, shut the door, and sat down. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I started thinking. When I called my parents back, it wasn't to argue. It was to document. I put the phone on speaker and let my voice stay even, almost detached. I asked simple questions. Where was the car now? How long did they expect my sister to use it? Had they told her anything about insurance? My mother sighed, already tired of me. Reagan, don't make this into a big thing. She just needs it for a while. A while, I repeated, carefully. Yes. You can manage. You always do. My father jumped in, his tone firm in that familiar way that ended conversations. You're being selfish. It's a car. Family helps family. What struck me was how quickly the narrative flipped. I wasn't the person whose property had been taken without permission. I was the problem for noticing. My sister, meanwhile, stayed conveniently silent. No call. No text. No thank you. Just absence, physical and emotional. Later that day, she posted a photo online. Nothing explicit. Just a steering wheel shot with a caption about fresh starts and a smiling emoji. People commented with hearts. My mother liked it within seconds. That's when I understood something important. This wasn't impulsive. It was coordinated. They had already agreed on the story where I was difficult and she was deserving. My role had been assigned without my presence. In private, my parents minimized it. In public, they normalized it. That contrast gave my sister confidence. She started acting like the car was hers, parking it at friends' places, running errands, living freely on something I was still making payments on. I said nothing. Not because I didn't care, but because I did. Silence, when chosen deliberately, makes people careless. They assume you've accepted their version of events. And once people believe they've won, they stop hiding. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. Friends noticed I was taking rides instead of driving myself, and I brushed it off with vague explanations. Car trouble, I'd say, smiling just enough to avoid questions. I didn't want sympathy, and I didn't want advice. I needed clarity. At night, doubt crept in. Not about what happened, I knew that was wrong, but about whether I was allowed to feel wronged by it. That's what long-term dismissal does. It trains you to interrogate your own reactions before questioning other people's actions. I replayed my parents' words in my head. Family helps family. You can manage. Don't make this a big thing. Each sentence carried an implication that my discomfort was less important than my sister's convenience. That objecting would make me cold, dramatic, ungrateful. My sister finally texted me 3 days later. Hey. Mom said you're upset. I really need the car right now. You understand, right? No apology. No acknowledgement of boundaries crossed. Just an expectation of compliance wrapped in familiarity. I stared at the message for a long time before replying with a single word, okay. That reply did more than reassure her, it erased me from the equation. From that moment on, plans were made without me. Decisions were communicated after the fact. My parents stopped checking in entirely, confident I'd adjusted. And outwardly, I had. I went to work. I laughed at the right moments. I showed up on time. Inside, something shifted. I stopped explaining myself, to them and to myself. I began noticing details I'd ignored before. Dates. Messages. Offhand comments that contradicted each other. Self-doubt gave way to observation. Isolation became distance. And distance gave me perspective. I wasn't being unreasonable. I was being conditioned. And conditioning only works if the subject stays unaware. A week later, the call came that everyone else would have taken as the end of the story. My mother sounded tense this time. Not apologetic, just inconvenienced. There's been an issue, she said. Your sister had a minor accident. Minor? That was the word she chose. I asked where the car was. She told me it had been towed after my sister rear-ended someone at a signal. No injuries, thankfully. Just damage. Enough to make the car undrivable. Enough to trigger insurance questions no one had prepared for. Then came the sentence that was supposed to finish me. The insurance might not cover everything, my father added. Since you didn't list her as a driver. There it was. The quiet transfer of blame. In their version of events, the problem wasn't that they had taken my car without permission and handed it to someone with a history of crashes. The problem was that I hadn't anticipated their decision and protected them from its consequences. They spoke as if the loss was already settled. Repairs would be expensive. Premiums would go up. Maybe the car would be totaled. My sister was shaken. Everyone was stressed. And somehow, I was expected to absorb the impact, financially and emotionally. I thanked them for letting me know and ended the call. For a few hours, I let the weight of it sit. The car I'd worked for was damaged. My parents were closing ranks around my sister. The story, if told publicly, would paint me as the owner who allowed it and then complained afterward. From the outside, it looked like I'd lost. Completely. That's why this moment mattered. Because this is where most people explode or surrender. They argue. They beg. They demand fairness from people who've already decided it doesn't apply. I did neither. Instead, I opened my laptop and made one call I'd delayed long enough. Not to my family. To someone whose job was to care about facts, not feelings. While my parents scrambled to manage the fallout, I stayed deliberately still. I didn't rush to the tow yard. I didn't confront my sister. I didn't try to fix anything for anyone. Silence, at this point, wasn't passive, it was protective. I requested copies of the police report through the non-emergency line, calmly explaining that I was the registered owner of the vehicle. I emailed my insurance company to ask a neutral question: what happens when a car is taken and driven without the owner's consent? I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I let them outline the process in writing. Each response gave me something valuable. Dates. Definitions. Language. My sister continued texting, increasingly anxious now. They're asking questions. Mom says you're not answering. Can you just come handle this? I didn't respond. For the first time in my life, I allowed discomfort to exist without immediately soothing it, for them or for myself. I kept going to work. I documented everything. Screenshots. Call logs. Messages that revealed assumptions they didn't realize they were making. Endurance isn't about tolerating pain endlessly. It's about choosing when to stop cushioning other people from consequences. They believed my calm meant compliance. That I'd eventually step in, sign something, take responsibility like I always had. They were wrong. By the end of that week, my inbox held a quiet but undeniable truth: the situation wasn't complicated. It had just been normalized. And normalization has a way of collapsing the moment it meets an external standard. I closed my laptop, took a breath, and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not anger. Control. Once I stepped out of the emotional fog, the pattern became obvious and uncomfortable. This wasn't the first time my things had been treated as communal property. It was just the first time the stakes were high enough to expose the system underneath. I thought back to smaller moments I'd dismissed. Money borrowed and returned late, if at all. Plans changed because my sister needed support. Boundaries reframed as selfishness. Each incident, isolated, seemed minor. Together, they formed a consistent rule. My stability existed to offset her chaos. What changed now was documentation. For the first time, my experience wasn't just emotional, it was verifiable. The spare key hadn't been misplaced, it had been intentionally redistributed. The car hadn't been loaned, it had been taken. The accident hadn't been unavoidable, it was statistically predictable. I reread messages from my parents, noting how language shifted depending on the audience. With me, it was obligation. With others, it was generosity. With my sister, it was entitlement disguised as reassurance. No one saw themselves as crossing a line because the line had been moved slowly over years. And I realized something else: they believed I wouldn't escalate because escalation would force them to defend their choices publicly. They were counting on my preference for privacy to protect them. That was their miscalculation. Awareness doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in quietly, like a chair being pulled out from under a story you've been sitting in for years. Once it's there, you can't pretend not to see it. I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with a hierarchy. And hierarchies only survive when the person at the bottom keeps explaining why they deserve better treatment. I stopped explaining. There was one thing my family didn't know, because they'd never had reason to ask. When I bought the car, I'd been meticulous. Not out of paranoia, but habit. I kept digital copies of everything: purchase agreement, registration, insurance policy, and a short email exchange with my agent where I'd explicitly declined adding additional drivers. At the time, it felt like a formality. Now, it was leverage. The police report listed my sister as the driver and me as the registered owner. It also noted that the vehicle had been accessed using a spare key. No theft charges were filed automatically, but the language mattered. Operated without owner's presence. Driver not listed on policy. Permission unclear. Unclear was generous. My insurance company followed up in writing. Because I had not reported the car as loaned and because my sister was not an authorized driver, liability exposure shifted. Not to me, but to the person who had taken control of the vehicle and the people who had facilitated it. That included my parents. I didn't share this with anyone. Not yet. Information loses power when it's announced too early. I let my family continue assuming I'd eventually cave. That assumption made them careless in texts and voicemails, phrases like, "We thought it would be fine and we didn't think you'd make a big deal out of it." I saved everything. I also learned something else. The tow yard had logged who authorized the release of the vehicle. Not me. My mother. Using my sister's phone. There were signatures. Time stamps. By the end of the week, I had a clean, chronological record: intent, access, use, damage, and attempted resolution, none of which included my consent. From the outside, it looked like patience. From the inside, it was preparation. And preparation is what separates emotional reactions from irreversible outcomes. Something shifted once I stopped waiting for acknowledgement. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd spent hoping someone would finally say, "You're right. This shouldn't have happened." When that hope dissolved, it left behind a calm I didn't recognize at first. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. Stopped imagining how I'd explain myself if given the chance. I no longer needed to convince anyone of my integrity. I had proof, and more importantly, I had clarity. My parents' calls became less frequent, more cautious. When they did reach out, their tone had changed. Still firm, but strained, like people sensing ground instability beneath familiar arguments. They asked what I was planning to do. I answered honestly, "I'm handling it." That phrase unsettled them. It offered no reassurance, no surrender. My sister tried a different approach. She cried. She apologized vaguely, careful not to admit fault. "I didn't think it would turn into all this," she said, as if the consequences had appeared on their own. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said, "I understand," and meant it. Understanding didn't require absolution. For the first time, I noticed how power actually moves. Not through volume or outrage, but through consistency. Through aligning actions with reality instead of expectation. I wasn't becoming colder, I was becoming precise. I no longer felt the urge to rush resolution. Time, it turned out, was on my side. Every day that passed without me stepping in forced them to confront the structure they'd built, one where responsibility flowed in only one direction. Internally, I released something old. The belief that love required sacrifice without consent. The idea that being the strong one meant absorbing damage quietly. Strength, I was learning, could also look like letting the truth stand on its own. I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded. And that was enough. By the second week, I had a plan, measured, deliberate, and irreversible. I wasn't acting on impulse. I had all the facts. I had documentation. I had legal clarity. And most importantly, I had patience. I started with small, strategic steps. I called my insurance company again, confirming coverage for unauthorized drivers and liability for damages. Every response was saved. Every detail logged. I made sure the tow yard's record of who released the car was secured. Photographs of the car's condition after the accident were time-stamped and untouched. Nothing could be disputed. Next, I mapped out my communications. I would address the situation publicly only once all evidence was indisputable. I avoided unnecessary calls. I didn't send angry messages. Every interaction I had with my parents or sister was calm, controlled. The less they saw me reacting, the more confident they became, and the easier it would be to let them reveal their own overreach. I also quietly confirmed legal procedures. As the registered owner, I had the right to refuse any further use of the car by unauthorized drivers. Any claim my parents or sister might make would be countered by documented proof. I wasn't threatening, they didn't know it yet, but everything was positioned so that once I acted, it would be impossible to contest. During this time, I reflected on my internal state. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't seeking drama. I was simply preparing for the moment when the narrative would shift from me as the compliant victim to me as the rightful owner enforcing reality. Every detail mattered. A message timestamped wrong, a call forgotten, a verbal statement unrecorded. It could have undermined the entire process. That's why I let my family underestimate me. Their carelessness was my advantage. Their confidence was a trap they didn't see. And I waited. Because when the moment came, I wanted it to be clean, undeniable, and satisfying, not just for me, but for anyone who had ever been quietly dismissed and underestimated. By the end of that week, my plan was complete. All that remained was execution. It was Saturday morning. The same parking lot where my car had disappeared now became the stage for its return. My parents had arranged to pick up the car from the tow yard themselves, assuming I would tag along, calm and accommodating as usual. I did show up, but under completely different terms. I arrived with all documents neatly organized, copies of police reports, insurance confirmations, and timestamps ready. I walked into the lot not flustered, not apologetic, not silent. Every step I took announced control. My mother tried to smile, a rehearsed warmth, but her eyes darted nervously. My father's usual firmness faltered slightly when he noticed the careful files in my hand. "Reagan," my mother started, attempting to claim authority, "we just wanted to." I held up a hand. "Let's review the documentation first," I said calmly. "Everything regarding this car, its use, and the accident has been confirmed by the tow yard, insurance, and the police." I laid out each paper in order. Dates, times, signatures. The evidence was indisputable. My sister lingered behind, realizing this was no longer a casual inconvenience. No amount of charm or apologies could override documented facts. She glanced at my files, then at my expression, and for the first time, her confidence faltered. People in the lot noticed the shift. No words were needed. My posture, my calm voice, the quiet assertion of authority, it was enough. The balance had changed. What had seemed like an everyday dispute was now unmistakably clear. I held control. I dictated the terms. I was no longer the compliant daughter or the accommodating sibling. I was the rightful owner. For the first time since the car vanished, the power dynamic had shifted. And this time, there would be no arguing, no dismissing, no casual assumptions. I had waited. I had documented. I had prepared. And now, I was standing, quietly, in command. My parents could have stopped there. They could have acknowledged the mistake, accepted responsibility, and let the situation de-escalate quietly. Instead, they did what people often do when they feel their authority slipping: they overreached. My father straightened his shoulders and said, louder than necessary, "This is getting out of hand. You're embarrassing us." Not "we're sorry." Not "we handled this wrong." Embarrassment. Reputation. Control. My mother followed quickly, her voice tightening. "Do you really want to involve outsiders in a family matter? Think about how this looks." That sentence was the mistake. Because in trying to reassert dominance, they confirmed intent. They weren't concerned about legality or fairness. They were concerned about optics. About the fact that people were watching now. Tow yard staff. A couple waiting nearby. A clerk who had already heard enough to understand the situation wasn't mutual. My sister stepped forward, defensive. "You said it was fine," she blurted out. "You didn't say no." I looked at her calmly. "I wasn't asked." Silence followed. Heavy. Unavoidable. Then my father said something he couldn't take back. "We're your parents. We had the right to decide what was best." There it was. The assumption made explicit. Not borrowed. Not loaned. Decided. The tow yard clerk cleared his throat and asked, politely, who was authorizing the release of the vehicle. My mother instinctively stepped forward again. "I am," she said. I handed the clerk my ID and the registration. "I am," I said, at the same time. The clerk paused. Looked at the documents. Then at the police report. That pause did more damage than any argument could have. It exposed the reality: authority doesn't come from confidence, it comes from legitimacy. And legitimacy was no longer on their side. My parents tried to walk it back then. Softer voices. Talk of misunderstanding. But the overreach had already happened. They'd said too much. Revealed too much. And once people incriminate themselves publicly, there's no graceful way to reclaim control. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. The facts spoke louder than anything I could say. I laid out every document, the police report, insurance statements, tow yard authorization, and the purchase agreement. Each piece told the same story. My sister had driven my car without permission. My parents had facilitated it knowingly. Liability rested squarely on them, not me. Every timestamp, every signature, every email corroborated my position. The clerk, now fully aware, nodded silently as he confirmed the paperwork. Everything appears correct. Registered owner has rightful claim, he said. Nothing else was necessary. My sister's face went pale. No apology, no deflection could undo what was now undeniable. My parents exchanged glances, their usual confidence replaced with discomfort. The overreach, the casual dismissal of my rights, and the assumption that I'd comply, all laid bare. I didn't speak much. I didn't have to. My calm, deliberate presentation carried more weight than any emotional outburst could have. I simply confirmed, this is my car. I'm taking it. The clerk handed me the keys. I felt the shift instantly. Power, once assumed to belong to them, had returned quietly but completely. My parents opened their mouths, then closed them. My sister stammered, searching for words. The weight of documentation, legality, and calm authority rendered them mute. By the time I started the engine, there was no question, the narrative had changed. I was no longer a passive participant in a story written by others. The car, my property, symbolized more than a vehicle. It represented boundaries, recognition, and respect finally enforced. For a moment, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Not vindictive. Not dramatic. Simply acknowledgement that justice, quiet and undeniable, had arrived. They had underestimated me for years. But in the presence of facts, careful preparation, and controlled patience, their assumptions collapsed. The scene wasn't just about a car. It was about authority, responsibility, and recognition of one's rightful space in the world. And in that quiet, undeniable moment, it all aligned perfectly. Once the facts were clear, the unraveling was almost immediate. My parents had spent years assuming that my silence meant compliance. That assumption had allowed them to make decisions, shift responsibility, and normalize my sister's entitlement. But with evidence in hand and authority reclaimed, their public image began to fracture before my eyes. My mother tried to explain, her voice tight, but the clerk and the few onlookers didn't need a narrative. The documents told the story more convincingly than any apology could. My father opened his mouth, then shut it, realizing that words alone could no longer control the situation. Every excuse, every casual dismissal, now appeared like a calculated disregard of reality. Even my sister, who had relied on charm and familiarity to shield her mistakes, froze. Her confidence evaporated in real time. The very behavior that had been rewarded for years, recklessness, entitlement, avoidance, was now exposed under scrutiny. No sympathy. No ally. Only the undeniable truth that she had operated outside boundaries set clearly by law and reason. What was striking wasn't humiliation, but inevitability. The collapse wasn't manufactured. It wasn't dramatic. It was the natural result of carelessness meeting preparation, arrogance meeting patience, and assumption meeting fact. My parents' reputation, built quietly over years on authority and assumed control, now bore cracks too obvious to ignore. And I didn't gloat. I didn't mock. I didn't need to. Justice, when executed through evidence, timing, and calm persistence, speaks louder than any voice could. The error in the lot was charged, not with drama, but with clarity. For the first time, I witnessed their perception of me shift. No longer the accommodating daughter, no longer the silent bystander, they now understood, without words, that my authority was legitimate, informed, and irreversible. In the space where humiliation had once existed for me, a new equilibrium settled. Not loud, not theatrical, but definitive. After that day, the dynamics at home changed subtly but permanently. My parents stopped making unilateral decisions about my belongings. My sister, cautious now, no longer assumed access to what was mine. The accident, the tow records, and my meticulous documentation had created a new boundary, one they could no longer ignore. Insurance adjustments were made. Liability was acknowledged. The car, fully repaired, returned to me under my terms, not theirs. The legal and procedural clarity I had painstakingly gathered ensured that no casual comment or assumption could ever be used against me again. At family gatherings, the shift was quiet but tangible. No dramatic confrontations. No vindictive remarks. Just recognition of an authority that had always existed but had finally been enforced. Even my parents, careful with their words, now measured their suggestions, understanding that calm, documented, and deliberate action carried more weight than their casual assumptions. For me, the satisfaction wasn't in humiliation, it was in the restoration of control, respect, and acknowledgement of fairness. Boundaries had been crossed, yes, but they had been reinforced in a way that couldn't be undone. And in the silence that followed, I realized something vital. Power is most effective when it is quiet, undeniable, and aligned with truth. Looking back, I understand now that the ordeal wasn't just about a car. It was about respect, boundaries, and the quiet assertion of one's rightful authority. For years, my compliance had been mistaken for weakness, my patience taken for granted. That morning, when my new car disappeared and my parents casually handed the keys to my sister, it could have been just another story of unfairness, but it became a turning point. Justice didn't arrive through shouting or confrontation. It arrived through preparation, observation, and patience. By documenting, understanding the patterns, and maintaining calm, I transformed a moment of humiliation into a lesson in power, mine and undeniable. I didn't need to humiliate anyone in return. I didn't need drama. I simply allowed facts, procedure, and patience to speak for themselves. In the end, my family witnessed a truth they had ignored for too long: authority and respect are earned, not assumed. And when they are enforced with dignity and precision, even the most confident arrogance collapses quietly but completely. I walked away that day knowing one thing clearly: control, calm, and credibility will always outlast chaos, entitlement, and careless overreach.